In the summer of 1862, there was an awful lot that was weighing on Abraham Lincoln's mind. There was the war, and there was the emancipation policy that was just beginning to develop. Congress had passed the Second Confiscation Act, and then early the next week, Lincoln revealed his plans to use that act as a way to build his own emancipation policy. And a few days after that, he wrote a very interesting private letter to a Unionist senator from Maryland named Reverdy Johnson, who had gone to occupied Louisiana, where federal troops were engaged in an attempt to begin the reconstruction of Louisiana into the Union. And they were encountering all kinds of friction over a number of different issues, but mainly involving the fate of the former slaves. Writing to Reverdy Johnson, who had reported to Lincoln about problems and who had passed along a letter from the military governor of the state, Lincoln said, "It seems the Union feeling in Louisiana is being crushed out by the course of General Phelps." This was an abolitionist general who was using his power in parts of the state to take former slaves, free them, and put them to work for wages. "Please pardon me," Lincoln writes, "for believing that that is a false pretense. The people of Louisiana," he writes, "all intelligent people everywhere, know full well that I never had a wish to touch the foundations of their society," meaning slavery, "or any right of theirs. With perfect knowledge of this, they forced a necessity upon me to send armies among them. And it is their own fault, not mine, that they are annoyed by the presence of General Phelps." Of course, Lincoln had always been saying, since the House Divided speech in 1858, that slavery would have to end one day, but he argued it should end by the voluntary choice of white Southerners in the states where it existed. His only position against slavery that mattered in terms of policy was to prohibit it from being extended or spread anywhere else. Now the war had started, and he was sending Union forces into southern states, holding them by force and freeing slaves by force. This is already happening in 1862, even before the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation. This is as a result of the frictions and abrasions of war and of the confiscation policies of the Congress. And Lincoln is not apologizing for this. He says, "If they could conceive of anything worse than General Phelps within my power, would they not better be looking out for it? They very well know the way to avert all of this is simply to take their place in the Union upon the old terms. If they will not do this, should they not receive harder blows rather than lighter ones?" And what happens next in this letter is all about these harder blows. This is Abraham Lincoln at his most intense during the period of the highest stakes in a war that's quickly changing into something far more revolutionary than anybody had anticipated. Lincoln, writing to Johnson, says, "You are ready to say I apply to friends what is due only to enemies," meaning those loyal masters in states like Louisiana or Maryland, where Johnson was from, who were afraid that the war was now beginning to erode their institution of slavery, even though they still, some of them anyway, were loyal to the Union. Then Lincoln says in the next line, a kind of remarkable thing. He says, "I distrust the wisdom, if not the sincerity of friends who would hold my hands while my enemies stab me." This is not the voice of the Abraham Lincoln most of us know, but it is a major part of his voice. "I would distrust the wisdom, if not the sincerity of friends who would hold my hands while my enemies stab me. This appeal of professed friends has paralyzed me more in the struggle than any other one thing." You can tell he's already decided a few days before that he's going to announce an emancipation policy. He's moved beyond the paralysis of trying to hold border state unionists, and he's determined to begin a process of waging a more revolutionary war. Then he refers to some incidents in the past. He tells Johnson, "You remember telling me the day after the Baltimore mob in April 1861 that it would crush all Union feeling in Maryland for me to attempt to bring troops over Maryland soil to Washington." This is the very outset of the war, when Union troops passing through Baltimore were attacked by secessionist sympathizers. "I brought the troops notwithstanding," Lincoln says, "and yet there was Union feeling enough left to elect a legislature the next autumn, which in turn elected a very excellent Union U.S. Senator," meaning Reverdy Johnson himself. By the way, Johnson replied to this months later. He missed the original letter and had to catch up to it months later, but replied to this particular recollection by saying, "It's not true. I never said that to you." But we don't know exactly what happened. We know this is what Lincoln writes here. And then he ends with an interesting series of comments about himself. He says, I am a patient man, always willing to forgive on the Christian terms of repentance, and also to give ample time for repentance. Still, I must save this government if possible. And then he offers what I think of as a kind of credo. Perhaps the most important credo of the war, and the way that is easiest to understand his success as a vigorous commander-in-chief. What I cannot do, he writes, of course I will not do. But it may as well be understood once and for all, I shall not surrender this game, leaving any available card unplayed. What I cannot do, of course I will not do, Lincoln says, but that implies that what is not prohibited is allowed. And he will play to the edge of the rules in order to win, using military necessity, suspending civil liberties, in some ways in defiance of the Chief Justice of the United States. Not necessarily breaking rules, but bending them for the sake of the preservation of the nation, in his view, the subsequent preservation of the Constitution, and the ultimate destruction of slavery. I shall not surrender this game, leaving any available card unplayed. Lincoln was not a gambler, but he was a very aggressive president, an executive, and commander-in-chief. And this letter to Reverdy Johnson captures that spirit. It's a private letter. It's a very revealing letter, and it comes at the moment of the war that was the most intense for Lincoln politically, and where his greatness was most needed.